Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our session on cloud event management best practices. My name is Lauren, and I'm the content manager for the Google Cloud community. Joining me is Jose Chavez, technical account manager at Google, who will be taking us through our content today and answering your questions live. Questions are encouraged, so please feel free to use the YouTube chat box to add in your questions, and we'll be sure to get to them either in the chat or at the end of the presentation. And for any questions that we don't get to, we'll be sharing a recap post in the Google Cloud community, including the recording today, key takeaways, written Q&A, and links to supporting resources. And the link to that community is in the YouTube description, so you can check that out and stay tuned there. So I know we have some great content to get to today. So with that, I will hand it over to you, Jose.
Awesome. Thank you, Lauren. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining in on today's session. So as we had mentioned, this will be covering cloud event management best practices and recommendations. I'll tell you a little bit more about my experience and my time as a technical account manager. However, just an overall agenda that we're going to cover is first to set the expectations for what you should expect out of our EMS services, right? And what options do you have as a customer? Then we'll talk about the preparation that you should be taking for your key events, talk about what you should do during the execution, and then how you should analyze post-event and what you should be paying attention to. And then we'll go into a bit more detail as to what considerations you should have for special events like Black Friday, Cyber Monday, especially going into this year. So as I mentioned, I've been a technical account manager for quite a while, and I have had experience across the entire cloud organization as a customer engineer, as a technical account manager, strategic cloud engineer, and even solutions engineer working in support. I've ran multiple peak season events for our SF customers, and as well as running them, I've also volunteered to support and be an individual contributor to other customers' peak season events, which includes Black Friday, Cyber Monday, as well as other key launches that they may have had. So I have an idea of what goes on across the industry and what the best practices that they follow. So let's go ahead and start by setting our expectations for event management services, right? What should you expect when you start engaging in this? And then what options do you have? So firstly, you should expect a three-phase approach. You'll be looking into preparation, execution, and analysis. The preparation, we usually recommend 1 to 3 months, but this could vary depending on when your peak season is, how long it lasts, how much of an impact it has to you as you go through this. So it could be even longer depending on the situation. For example, Black Friday, Cyber Monday, some of the things you want to consider is capacity planning, having some sort of escalation plan, any tabletop exercises or simulations that you want to run with your account team, anything of that sort to prepare for this event. Then we have the second phase, which is our execution. This is a bit more tactical, and it happens during the event, depending on how long the event is. This is where you would have your escalation paths ready, working with your account team to have war rooms created and virtual conferences ready to be jumped on during a situation, and then working with our support as well in the case that there is an issue. And then ultimately, the analysis piece of it, right, happens 1 to 2 weeks, but really it could really go into months, right? As you review how was our support team and how do you respond to that, right? How are the incidents and how do you address those? So we say 1 to 2 weeks, but this could really be a longer term plan depending on how much of an eventful season you had. So that being said, let's talk about the options you have to use with your account team. You have the EMS services, which are provided to you by premium support. And then you have a bit more of a higher touch offer with a PSO engagement, which is paid for, and you get more people on the team. So the biggest differences are the people who are in charge of running your EMS for your event season, right? If you're working with your technical account manager and your account team, between them and the customer engineer, they'll be able to work with you on your capacity planning, best practices, and depending on their expertise or how good of a connection you have, it could potentially work with having some tabletop simulations or even some architecture reviews with our product managers. When you pay for the PSO engagement, you actually get dedicated resources who work with you on this. So these are expected when you pay for this, right? Like load testing, architecture review. You'll have a bit more visibility to your event. So if you are a customer whose event is super critical and can't have any downtime or need to be prepared the best way you can, consider a PSO engagement. Otherwise, if you're a customer who has downstream customers who are affected by BFCM, you may want to consider working with your account team. It all depends on your situation and how much you want to invest in it. Ultimately, one of my favorite quotes that I've read is, by failing to prepare, you are preparing to fail. So that's what we're here for, right? We're trying to prepare so that we don't run into issues during our peak season events. One of the preparation pieces that I want to cover is capacity planning. And this is super, super critical. It's so critical, in fact, that technical account managers have this as a priority for us to cover with you on a quarterly basis. So capacity planning, there's two things that you want to consider. It's your quota and capacity, right? We know that quota does not equal capacity. We can summarize this in two easy forms. Quota is the amount of resource that you can use, that you're allowed to use, and capacity is the amount of resource that we, Google, can provide. So at times it may be that your quota may exceed the actual capacity that we have. So you can't expect just because you have the quota, you'll be able to have the capacity. And then on top of that, there are certain quota-like limitations, which we call limits, that prevent you from going even further than what the limitation is. So generally, this is why we stress capacity planning, because although the quota you see is there, the capacity may not be there. Capacity planning helps us think through your key event, think about what you'll be needing, and if there's any roadblocks for that, we can start planning for alternatives, mitigations, or other recommendations to ensure that even though the capacity isn't there, we're meeting the goals that you have. And so we have other options for capacity as well, known as reservations. We'll go into further detail here. But for now, I want to share with y'all a diagram that I have created for my customers to emphasize what you should expect when you want to increase your quota, especially in preparation for your key events. So here's the process flow. As you can see, it could take anywhere between hours to days to weeks, right? Depending on it. You have 3 channels of creating a quota increase request. You can create it via the GCP console, via support case, or through a organic forecast with your account team. So the way I usually recommend which path to take and what to do is depending on whether or not you have time to forecast. So say you are in the middle of your peak event and you need quota because this was something that you didn't plan for. You want to go into your console, or you want to create a support ticket and request that quota increase and work with the support engineer to essentially meet those thresholds to get your quota increase accepted, right? There's an automatic threshold which determines whether it's auto approved or not. If it's not, this will go into a more manual review, which could take hours into days, depending on how big the resource is, right? The best thing to do really is to work with your account team and create a forecast plan prior to your event so that you have these quotas already ready to go, they're increased, and you don't actually have to work very hard to get them approved during the actual event, right? That's why the preparation is super key. So when you work with your account team, it gives you the visibility that you need, and it gives you the flexibility in case there's any roadblocks. So if there's anything I want y'all to take away from this at the end of the day, is that you should work with your account team to create that forecast and work with our capacity team. So earlier I had mentioned reservations and what they could be used for. So I'll tell you a little bit about them and what the use cases are and if you should be considering reservations, right? So ultimately, it's our option for higher assurance for obtaining capacity. It's essentially billed at the same rate as the resources that are running, and it also qualifies for discounts and any contractual discounts that you may have and work across multiple of our products. A reservation is just as it sounds. It essentially provides you that capacity beforehand, and it's yours even if it goes down, we will not provision it to anyone else. So some reason you should consider a reservation is if you have a really an application that scales very quickly, right? It scales up and scales down. When it scales down, those machines will still be yours, and so you can essentially ensure a minimum use of machines for even your managed instance groups. Anything that scales really is where you want to consider your reservation if you have if you have to keep those machines. So what do you need to create your reservations? Essentially the same information that you would need for your regular VM instances. And on top of that, I'll talk about in which zone you want them applied to, which project. These are some of the parameters that you have to have, and you create this over on the console itself. So if you want a higher assurance, even more than reservations, I highly encourage you to work with your account team and talk to your technical account manager to understand if there's options that we can provide that provide even higher assurance. So in part of the preparation as well, I want to cover what responsibilities we have for y'all as a technical account manager. These responsibilities are more for the background. So we work with our support team to give them awareness to your event. We give them references to your architecture that we have, any information as to who we should be working with, what the escalation paths look like, which products are super key and critical for us to monitor. Your technical account manager should be doing this in the background with our support team so that during the time of your event, you have our support is well equipped to help you. They're also in charge of the escalation paths and any communication you have with them. So beforehand, as we had mentioned, creating these war rooms and escalation paths is super critical, and the technical account manager will be in charge of that so that during the time of your event, if there is an issue, you can meet with them and be able to effectively work together to coordinate support, engineers, anyone who you may need on the call. So that goes without saying that all of this strategy, right, all of this planning is great, but we have to execute it. So another great quote is, without strategy, execution is aimless, and without execution, strategy is useless. So what does the execution look like? Well, here are some best practices that I have found when working with our customers. The first and utmost important thing is escalation paths and war rooms. This is super critical during an event because if there is an issue, which is generally the most impactful piece of an event, you want to have someone on call. You want to have someone working with you on the Google side of things, ready to connect you with whoever it is that you need to be connected with, or alternatively, provide updates if there are certain issues going on. So get those war rooms ready and get those escalation paths sorted out. The other recommendation is, if you are using reservations, consider starting them up about 10 days in advance. The reason for this is because that 10-day period gives you some time to adjust for any specific issues that you may not have anticipated. For example, if the capacity is not available on Monday, may be available the next day. So that's where the recommendation comes from. You also want to keep track of everything that's going on during the event, right? Monitor the traffic, the logs, the issues, essentially anything that will help you with the analysis. And this will be important because, of course, peak season events happen on a continual cadence. So in reality, this will help you plan for your next one and even be more efficient in all the terms. So the last piece of advice that I like to give for event management is to be very aware of your support and be very aware of the information you give. During these incidents, our support is ready to work with you. However, they need the information critical to help start investigations. So open your P1 tickets in any case if that is needed. Provide the information for our support agents. Let them know what's the product, what's the issue that you're facing, what are you expecting. Any of those details are super critical for them so that they can start investigating immediately. Am I recommending to open P1s for everything? Not necessarily, but I do recommend be generous here because it is a lot better to say we've opened this at a P1, but it should be lower than it is to say we've spent hours on this, but this is actually a P0, P1, right? It's easier to backtrack than to have to move forward. So, be conscious of this and provide the information for our support to work with you. So we talked about the preparation and the execution. What happens after? Well, we all know that an event is not over until everyone's tired of talking about it. So what's the overview? What's the analysis that you should be conducting? Well, I've summarized this into 4 points. The first thing is a timeline recap. This is super critical, as I said, because this will help you plan your next event as you continue maturing your event management services and maturing how you handle these, right? You want to capture what periods you had. When did the traffic increase? When did the traffic decrease? Was there anything unexpected? At what point did that happen? And when did certain issues arrive, right? How long did it take to resolve those issues? This is all data that's super critical to capture so that you're ready for the next event. You also want to address essentially what went well, what went bad, and what were you lucky on, and capture the timeline for that. You also want to do a lot of root cause analysis, or RCAs, for the specific issues that happened. When it happened, where was the issue at? Was it an internal issue? Was it an external issue? Was the issue more in the support process? Was the issue more in creating the support ticket, right? Where was the issue, and document any lessons that you learned here so that you can effectively create a playbook for the future events when they come by. In terms of optimizing, especially for cost, you want to look at what your predictions were versus what actually was needed. So compare those, right? If you had created reservations, did you over provision? Did you under provision? Did you find yourself stocking out and needing more resources, but they weren't available, right? What situations happened here, and what did you predict versus what actually happened? And start looking at where you can start saving some money or potentially preparing better so that you save in the sense of avoiding an escalation or an incident. What was necessary and what wasn't. And then ultimately gather all this information in a postmortem, review them with your key stakeholders, and let them know that you've been working with Google for this event and that you have a plan to improve the next one, so that ultimately we're always improving on the previous event, and eventually you'll get to a boring event period where there is no incident, you run as expected, and things are great. So that being said, there are special considerations that we have. For example, Black Friday, Cyber Monday. This year is a super special year as well because we have worldwide elections happening in November. We have the World Cup happening in the winter season. We have holiday season as well, right? Everything's kind of gathering together. This is one of those years where there was a lot of planning that actually happened in late May, even early June. So we're talking 5 to 6 months in advance of all of this. So Black Friday and Cyber Monday are a special event, and certain precautions are happening earlier than your other event seasons. So here's a timeline that I believe is a pretty good estimate of when you should start working on planning if you are a Black Friday, Cyber Monday customer. So you want to start early in June with your initial capacity planning. This means finding what projects are critical during this time period, who needs the capacity, what capacity do you need, have the conversations with our capacity team, whether they see certain roadblocks, constraints, or anything that you should be worried about. And then from there, start planning any alternatives or mitigations or working around the recommendations from our capacity team. You also want to look at any reservation agreements that you may need to sign, or even check in twice or 3 times with your capacity team in the coming months so that you ensure that whatever recommendations they gave are still valid and that there hasn't been a change. Between this time as well, you want to look into the other optional tasks that we have mentioned, right? You want to set some time to do some load testing, making sure you understand what your system can handle, reviewing your architecture to make sure that everything is up to date and you're doing the best practices, reviewing your disaster recovery plan. In the case of the worst case scenario, you'll be able to bounce back from it quickly, doing some tabletop simulations and testing for this, right? All of these are tasks that you want to consider. And again, there's PSO engagements or working with your TAM so that by the time Black Friday, Cyber Monday comes, you'll be more than ready and confident that this season will be a fairly easy season. So, thank y'all for listening to me speak about this. I've provided some resources here for y'all to follow. We'll share this out after the presentation as well. And I believe we're on the Q&A session.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jose, for that information, for that presentation. As you said, we will be sharing those resources and this recording in the community, which the link to that is in the YouTube description. So keep an eye out. If you were furiously taking notes, you will be able to refer back to what we presented today. So with that, we are going to start with some of the questions that we received through the community first. But if you have any questions, please feel free to add those into the YouTube chat box and we'll be sure to get to them. Okay, so one question we have first is, what is the difference between cloud logging, client libraries, and agents? How do I know which one I should use?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And essentially, the biggest difference between the libraries and the agents is the way they call the logging API. So client libraries will call the logging API directly, whereas an agent will act as a proxy. So you should ask yourself questions like, do you want logs to be recovered if something were to crash? How do you want to communicate with your application, right? Does your application sit outside of GCP or can it communicate internally directly, right? We have lots of good documentation on this publicly, and we'll share the links. With y'all here.
Great. Yep. And I think just before getting to this question, Jose, I'm going to bring one up that was asked in the chat. So Stephen was asking, is this relevant for me if I have no team yet? And after asking to clarify, that means a technical account manager. So do you have any recommendations or tips to provide if someone does not yet have a technical account manager when it comes to cloud event management?
Yeah, so this is a good question, Stephen. Thank you for it. And the answer will be almost multifaceted. So the technical account manager is kind of like an extra step when, as a business, you purchase your premium support, which comes with a TAM. If you're working with Google Cloud and you have an account team as well, for example, your FSR or your customer engineer, you may be able to work with them to see if they can help provide that connection with our Google teams. It all depends on the relationship you have with an account team. If you don't have an account team, for example, if you're an individual contributor to your own project, some of these recommendations still apply. However, it'll have to be more self-service than anything else. For example, your quotas and your capacity, right? Even though you have the quota, start taking into consideration what do I do if I have no capacity, right? Can I move to a separate region? Can I move to a separate zone? Do I have any disaster recovery plans in place, right? So that would be a situation where, as I mentioned, right, if you have a TAM, your TAM can connect you with our capacity team. But if you don't have a TAM, in that case, it'll be more self-service. So you'll have to have almost a backup plan in the case that your capacity isn't being met. So what do you fail over to, right? So all of the recommendations we provide here are still applicable. However, unfortunately, it'll be more self-service.
Makes sense. Okay. So the next question we had is, GKE in region US East 1 is not able to connect with internal load balancer US Central 1, configured with Cloud Run as backend in US Central 1, even though they're in the same VPC. How do I make this possible?
Yeah, so in short, the answer is that your GKE instance, your load balancer, and your Cloud Run instance have to be running on the same region, on the same VPC. So we have a working example in our public documentation, and we'll share that out as well.
Great. All right, next is, suppose I'm running jobs with 1,000 parallel tasks each. Roughly how many jobs can I run simultaneously without overriding the system in a project?
Yeah, so for this question, I'm assuming Cloud Run is the product in question, in which case we do have a few limitations at the moment. So currently, each job can run up to 100 tasks in parallel, and you can run up to 1,000 jobs in a region. So, unfortunately, it sounds like this hypothetical may not align well with our current limitations. But again, this is assuming Cloud Run, right? And sorry about that, Lauren. I believe I might have skipped over a question by double clicking.
All good. Yeah, we'll go back to it. Great. Okay, so how can I calculate the bandwidth usage of a single VM starting from the first of each month? I'm using Metrics Explorer, but it doesn't support each month.
Yeah, so this was actually a pretty good and complicated question because it appears that you're not the only one asking this. An excellent solution that I have seen is to use MQL and essentially fetching the metrics and using the add functions to aggregate the metric for bytes sent or bytes received and overall have it grouped by a 30-day period. We have some documentation on how you can use MQL for certain actions like this, so we'll share that documentation out. But generally, if you have some trouble coming up with the query, I do recommend working with our support and getting a bit more of a hands-on approach there.
Great. Makes sense. Okay. How can I extract application logs, Magento 2 in my case, from a GCE virtual machine? I tried to use the ops agent, but it doesn't extract the application logs, only the instances, audit, or user logs.
Yeah, it's a good question. So looking into this, we do have a lot of documentation as to how to extract application logs, and it actually is the ops agent. So it may be that there's other factors at play, but we do have an excellent video that walks you through the process and also explains the reasoning behind how the ops agent works to extract these. These all also extract to cloud logging. So I believe, if you're trying to use cloud logging, this would be an excellent resource for you to use.
Great. And we just added that link to the YouTube video in the chat for quick access there.
Awesome.
Okay, I think we have just a few more. So again, if you have any final questions, feel free to add those into the chat and we'll be sure to get to them. Does either GKE Autopilot mode or Cloud Run support auto-scaling based on custom metrics sent from my application?
Yeah, so I'll focus more on the GKE piece of it because we do have public documentation that talks about how you can adjust horizontal pod autoscaling based on custom metrics. So we'll provide the link for that as well. As for Cloud Run, this may be a question better suited for our support. So I highly encourage y'all reaching out for that as well.
Great. The link, again, is in the chat, and we'll be compiling those in the recap post afterwards. Okay, how do I know which load balancer option to use? This is a bit of a general question, but if you can provide any recommendations or general guidance, that'd be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have pretty good documentation to help decide on which load balancer option you want to use. So in general, you want to ask questions as to, do you need external or internal? Do you need a regional or global? Do you need to have a pass-through or proxy connection? What kind of protection from DDoS do you want? We have pretty excellent documentation as well. Again, I link to these public docs because super well written and pretty detailed as to what you should be considering when choosing your load balancer.
Great. All right, I think we just have a couple more. Can I request GPU quota increases when I'm on the free GCP trial?
Yeah, good question. So unfortunately, if you're on the GCP trial, which is the $300 promotional credit over 90 days, you cannot you can't assign GPUs to your VMs, and therefore you can't increase the quota for your GPUs. You'll either have to wait until you use the $300 credit, or you wait 90 days, or you upgrade yourself to a paid billing account to start using GPUs and requesting GPU quota increases.
Got it. All right, this will be our last one for today. I was limited by Google, CPU all regions, 12 vCPU, and CPU in the region, 8 vCPU. Can I increase it? Because my GKE needs to auto provision and auto scale with high traffic. Can you please help explain the quota to me and help me resolve it?
Yeah, so any all region quotas, for example, in this case, CPU all region, is sometimes applied to newer projects or accounts on GCP. So this will take higher priority than your regional quotas. So for example, If your regional quota is 8 vCPU and you're running 2 or 3 regions maxed out at 8, you'll be capped out right at 12 rather than 24 because that takes higher priority. My recommendation would be to reach out to support because they may have some tools to work with you around this, or they may have some more context as to what limitations you may be facing here.
Makes sense. All right. Well, thank you so much, Jose. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. This was an excellent session, and I hope for anyone who's preparing for Black Friday, Cyber Monday, any other upcoming major launches or events that these recommendations have helped you. And if you do have any remaining questions, the community is always there for you. And again, that link is in the YouTube description. So with that, Jose, I just want to say thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us. Do you have any final takeaways or recommendations before we close out for today?
Yeah, ultimately, thanks for having me. Final thoughts is event management services can be either an accounting thing or it can be an individual person thing, right? As y'all had mentioned earlier, right? If you don't have an account team, take these considerations into thought and think about how you can work around it for the moment. And of course, our support is always available there to reach out for any questions. So take these advice and best practices and adjust them to best fit your needs so that ultimately you can run a good event while having minimal issues during this.
Awesome. Thank you so much again. And we hope to see you again soon. And we'll all keep in touch in the community until then. All right. Have a good one, everyone.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.